August 18th, 1590. Roanoke Island, North Carolina. Governor John White stood on the shore of Roanoke Island and stared at the silent forest before him. 3 years. He had been gone for 3 years, delayed by war and storms and circumstances beyond his control. 3 years since he had sailed away from his daughter, his granddaughter, and 114 other colonists who had trusted him to return with supplies. 3 years wondering if they were alive, if they were safe, if they blamed him for abandoning them. Now he was back, and the settlement was empty. The palisade walls still stood, weathered, but intact. White walked through the entrance, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, the houses were gone. Not burned, not destroyed by violence, but carefully dismantled. Someone had taken them apart deliberately, salvaging the wood and materials. This was not the scene of a massacre. This was evidence of an organized departure. White searched every corner of the fort. He found no bodies, no signs of struggle, no blood on the ground. The silence was absolute, except for the wind in the trees and the distant sound of waves. His calls went unanswered. The colonists were gone. Then he saw it. Carved into one of the palisade posts, 5 feet above the ground, the letters were clear and deliberate. CROATOAN. White's breath caught. CROATOAN. It was the name of an island 50 miles south, home to the CROATOAN people, Native Americans, who had been friendly to the English before White had left for England in 1587. He had made an agreement with the colonists. If they needed to relocate, they would leave a message indicating where they had gone, and if they were in distress, they would carve a Maltese cross above the message. There was no cross, just the word CROATOAN. White felt a surge of hope mixed with desperate anxiety. His daughter Eleanor was out there somewhere. His granddaughter Virginia Dare, just 9 days old when he had last seen her, the first English child born in the New World, was now 3 years old. Were they on CROATOAN Island? Were they alive? Were they safe? He searched for more clues. Near the entrance, carved into a tree, were the letters CRO, an unfinished message, or simply an abbreviation of the same word. White returned to the ships anchored offshore. He pleaded with the captain to sail south to CROATOAN Island immediately. They had to find the colonists. They had to know what happened. But a storm was brewing. The anchors had been damaged. The captain insisted they had to leave for safer waters. They would return in the spring, he promised. They would search CROATOAN then. John White never returned. He never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. He never learned what became of the 115 colonists of Roanoke Island. He spent the rest of his life haunted by that single word carved in wood. CROATOAN. The lost colony had entered history, and it would remain lost forever. But the story didn't begin in 1590. It began 7 years earlier, with dreams of empire and gold. In 1583, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize the lands of North America. Raleigh was ambitious, charismatic, a favorite of the Queen. He envisioned English settlements across the Atlantic, establishing trade routes and challenging Spanish dominance in the New World. He would name this new land Virginia, in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Raleigh never set foot in America himself. Instead, he financed expeditions led by others. The first voyage, in 1584, was exploratory. 2 ships under Captains Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow sailed to the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. They found Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land between the mainland and the barrier islands, protected from the ocean but accessible by boat. The reports they brought back to England were glowing. The land was fertile, the climate temperate, the native people friendly and curious about the English. Amadas and Barlow brought back 2 CROATOAN men, Manteo and Wanchese, who traveled to England and became celebrities in Raleigh's circle. They learned English, shared knowledge about their homeland, and helped Raleigh plan his colonial venture. In 1585, Raleigh sent a second expedition, this one to establish a permanent settlement. 7 ships carried approximately 600 men, commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, with Ralph Lane as governor of the colony. The ships arrived at Roanoke in August 1585. Most of the men returned to England with Grenville, but 107 stayed behind under Lane's command to build a fort and establish England's first American colony. It was a disaster. From the beginning, Lane's colonists were soldiers and gentlemen, not farmers or craftsmen. They expected to find gold and riches like the Spanish had found in South America. Instead, they found dense forests, swamps, mosquitoes, and hard work. They depended on the local CROATOAN people for food, but Lane's arrogant and aggressive behavior quickly turned allies into enemies. The CROATOAN chief, Wingina, initially welcomed the English, but as the colonists demanded more food and explored aggressively into CROATOAN territory, relations deteriorated. Lane became convinced Wingina was plotting against them. In June 1586, Lane led a preemptive strike against a CROATOAN village, killing Wingina and several warriors. Days later, Sir Francis Drake arrived at Roanoke with a fleet that had been raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. Drake offered Lane supplies and reinforcements, but a hurricane struck while they were transferring goods. The storm destroyed boats and supplies. Demoralized and desperate, Lane made a decision: abandon Roanoke and return to England with Drake. On June 18, 1586, all 107 colonists sailed away. Raleigh's first colony had lasted less than a year. 2 weeks later, a supply ship arrived at Roanoke to find the settlement deserted. 2 weeks after that, Grenville's relief fleet arrived with 400 men and a year's worth of supplies. Finding no trace of Lane's colonists, Grenville left 15 men behind to maintain England's claim to the island and returned to England. Those 15 men were never seen again. Local Native Americans later reported they had been attacked and killed by mainland tribes hostile to the English presence. But Raleigh was not finished. Despite 2 failures, he remained convinced that English colonization of America was possible and necessary. In 1587, he organized a 3rd expedition. This time, the colonists would not be soldiers but families, men, women, and children committed to building a permanent community. John White, an artist and cartographer who had been on the 1585 voyage, was appointed governor. White was 53 years old, educated, thoughtful, and unlike Lane, he understood that survival depended on cooperation with Native Americans rather than conquest. White recruited approximately 118 colonists, including his pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. The plan was to establish a settlement on the Chesapeake Bay, far north of Roanoke, in territory that offered better harbors and hadn't been contaminated by Lane's violence. But the ship's pilot, Simon Fernandez, had his own agenda. Fernandez wanted to get back to privateering, raiding Spanish ships for profit. Escorting colonists to the Chesapeake would take too long. Against White's protests, Fernandez dropped the colonists at Roanoke Island in July 1587 and refused to take them any farther. White and the colonists had no choice. They rebuilt the fort Lane had abandoned. They repaired houses. They planted crops. On August 18, 1587, exactly 3 years before White would return to find them gone, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of hope that this colony might succeed where others had failed. But within weeks, the colonists were in trouble. Food supplies were running low. The Native Americans remembered Lane's violence and were wary of helping. Winter was coming. The colonists held a meeting and made a desperate decision. John White would sail back to England on the last ship, before winter storms made the voyage impossible, and return with supplies in the spring. White was torn. Leaving meant abandoning his daughter and infant granddaughter, but staying meant everyone might starve. On August 27, 1587, 9 days after Virginia's birth, John White boarded the ship and sailed for England. Before leaving, he made an agreement with the colonists. If they had to relocate for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were in danger or distress, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name. White arrived in England in November 1587. He immediately began organizing a relief voyage. But in 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada. 130 warships sent to invade England. Queen Elizabeth commandeered every available English ship to defend the realm. No ship could be spared for a relief mission to Roanoke. White watched helplessly as months became a year, then 2 years. He wrote letters, begged Raleigh for help, pleaded with ship captains. Finally, in March 1590, he secured passage on a privateer's ship that agreed to stop at Roanoke, but the voyage was plagued by delays. The ship spent months raiding Spanish vessels in the Caribbean. It wasn't until August 1590, 3 years after White had left, that the ship finally approached Roanoke Island. White saw smoke rising from the forest as they neared the island. His heart leaped. The colonists were there. They were alive. They were signaling. But as the ship drew closer, White realized the smoke was coming from the forest, not the settlement. Later, they would learn it was just a wildfire. Nature's cruel joke on a desperate man. On August 18, 1590, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, John White stepped onto Roanoke Island and found it abandoned. The colonists were gone. The houses were dismantled, and carved into wood were the letters that would haunt him forever. CROATOAN. Thank you for listening all the way through. I'm genuinely curious. What do you think happened to the lost colony? Do you think they survived, or did they perish? Let me know your theory in the comments below. John White returned to England in October 1590, broken and desperate. He spent the remaining years of his life trying to organize another expedition to search for the colonists, but he never succeeded. Raleigh had lost interest in American colonization, distracted by other ventures. The political climate had changed. England's resources were stretched thin. No one wanted to finance a search for colonists who were almost certainly dead. White died in 1593, 3 years after his failed return to Roanoke. He never learned what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or the 114 other colonists who had vanished. His last written words about the lost colony were filled with anguish. I greatly joyed that I had safely found a certain token of their being at CROATOAN, which is the place where Manteo was born, and the savages of the island are friends. White believed the colonists had gone to CROATOAN Island voluntarily, seeking refuge with Manteo's people. But he never got the chance to prove it. For 17 years, Roanoke Island remained abandoned and largely forgotten. Then, in 1607, England established a new colony at Jamestown, Virginia, 100 miles north of Roanoke. Captain John Smith, the famous leader of Jamestown, heard rumors from local Native Americans about white-skinned people living among tribes to the south. Some spoke of a chief who had books and could write. Others described people with gray eyes and light hair, clearly not Native American. Smith sent search parties south, hoping to find survivors of the lost colony. The parties never reached CROATOAN, but they returned with intriguing reports. In 1608, Jamestown settler William Strachey recorded testimony from a Native American chief named Powhatan, who claimed that he had recently ordered the massacre of a group of English colonists who had been living at Chesapeake Bay. Powhatan reportedly said he killed them because he feared they would ally with Jamestown against him. Were these the lost colonists? Had they traveled from CROATOAN to the Chesapeake only to be slaughtered years later? Strachey believed so, but he had no proof. No bodies were found. No survivors came forward. It was just another story, another theory, another piece of a puzzle that refused to come together. Over the following decades, more stories emerged. Explorers traveling through North Carolina encountered Native Americans with suspiciously European features: light skin, gray or blue eyes, brown or blonde hair. Some spoke broken English or New English words. One tribe, the Lumbee, claimed descent from the lost colonists, passing down oral traditions about white people who joined their ancestors. But oral traditions are notoriously unreliable, subject to embellishment and distortion over generations. Without physical evidence, these stories remained tantalizing, but unproven. The first serious historical investigation of the lost colony began in the 18th century, as historians and antiquarians became interested in America's colonial origins. They examined John White's maps and journals, studied Spanish documents, and interviewed descendants of Native American tribes who might have had contact with the colonists. Three main theories emerged, and these same three theories remain debated today, more than 400 years later. Theory 1. The colonists died soon after White left, victims of disease, starvation, or violence. This was the pessimistic view, but it had supporting evidence. The colonists had arrived at Roanoke unprepared for winter. Their food supplies were inadequate. Relations with local tribes were strained after Lane's violence. Disease was rampant in early colonial settlements. Jamestown would lose 80% of its colonists to disease and starvation in its first years. Perhaps the Roanoke colonists suffered a similar fate. The word CROATOAN could have been carved by a few survivors who intended to flee to the island, but died before they could make the journey. Or it could have been a desperate message from people who knew they were doomed, indicating where their bodies might eventually be found. The lack of bodies didn't disprove this theory. Bodies decompose quickly in North Carolina's humid climate, especially in forest environments. Wild animals scatter remains. Floods wash away evidence. If the colonists died and were buried in unmarked graves, or if their bodies were left unburied in the forest, nothing would remain after 400 years. Theory 2. The colonists were killed, either by Spanish forces or by hostile Native American tribes. This theory gained traction because of Spanish documents discovered in the 19th century. Spain considered England's colonization attempts an invasion of Spanish territory. Spanish officials in Florida and the Caribbean monitored English activities closely and discussed sending forces north to destroy the Roanoke settlement. In 1588, a Spanish intelligence report described an English settlement on the Outer Banks, with a governor and a council, and 2 vessels. The description matched Roanoke. Spanish officials debated whether to attack, but the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 ended Spain's ability to launch offensive operations in North America. Still, some historians argue that a Spanish raiding party could have struck Roanoke in 1588 or 1589, massacring the colonists and leaving no survivors. The Native American violence theory was based on testimonies collected at Jamestown. Several tribes had reasons to hate the English after Lane's brutal tactics in 1585-1586. The 15 men Grenville left behind in 1586 had reportedly been killed by mainland tribes. Why wouldn't the same tribes attack a larger English settlement? Perhaps the colonists had been gradually worn down by raids, ambushes, and sieges, eventually overwhelmed and killed. The problem with both violence theories was the lack of evidence. No colonist bodies were ever found. No Spanish records confirmed an attack on Roanoke. And crucially, John White found no signs of battle, no burned buildings, no broken weapons, no blood. The dismantled houses suggested an organized departure, not a panicked flight or a massacre. Theory 3. The colonists left Roanoke voluntarily and integrated with Native American tribes. This was John White's theory, and it remained the most popular among historians and archaeologists. The evidence seemed to support it. The word CROATOAN without a distress cross, the carefully dismantled houses, the absence of bodies or signs of violence. The colonists had known they were vulnerable on Roanoke Island. They had limited supplies, poor farmland, and hostile neighbors. CROATOAN Island, 50 miles south, offered several advantages. Manteo, the CROATOAN man who had traveled to England and remained friendly to the English, lived there. His people had consistently been peaceful toward the colonists. The island had better fishing and more resources. Moving to CROATOAN made strategic sense. But if the colonists went to CROATOAN, why didn't they stay there? When John White tried to reach CROATOAN in 1590, storms prevented the landing. When Jamestown sent search parties south in the early 1600s, they never reached CROATOAN either. By the time anyone actually searched the island thoroughly, decades had passed. Any traces of the colonists would have disappeared. Some historians argued the colonists didn't stay on CROATOAN, but used it as a temporary refuge before splitting into smaller groups. Some might have traveled north to the Chesapeake Bay, where Powhatan claimed to have massacred them. Others might have moved west, integrating with interior tribes like the Lumbee, the Saponi, or others. This diaspora theory explained the scattered reports of European-looking Native Americans across North Carolina and Virginia. If the colonists had divided into multiple groups seeking different destinations, they would have left traces in multiple locations. Some groups might have survived and integrated successfully. Others might have perished. The lost colony wasn't a single fate, but multiple fates for multiple groups. Archaeological evidence began emerging in the 20th century, but it raised as many questions as answers. In 1937, stones began appearing across North Carolina, with messages allegedly carved by Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. The Dare stones described the colonists' journey inland, hardships they faced, and Eleanor's eventual death. They generated enormous excitement until most were revealed as hoaxes created by a stonecutter seeking attention and money. But one Dare stone, the first one found, was never definitively proven false. Some experts believe it might be genuine, though the message it contained was heartbreaking. Eleanor claimed that most colonists died of disease within 2 years of White's departure, and that she and a few others were living among Native Americans. If true, it meant the lost colony perished not from violence, but from illness, and that John White's daughter died without ever seeing him again. In the 1990s and 2000s, modern archaeological techniques were applied to the mystery. Ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis of soil, and systematic excavations at Roanoke Island and surrounding sites sought physical evidence of the colonists. Archaeologists found European artifacts from the 1580s, bits of pottery, metal fragments, a sword hilt, confirming that the colonists had been there. but they found nothing indicating where the colonists went. More promising discoveries came from other sites. In 2012, researchers examining one of John White's maps found hidden marks under patches. When the patches were removed using modern imaging technology, symbols appeared indicating 2 locations inland from Roanoke, one at the confluence of the CROATOAN and Roanoke rivers, another near Edenton. Archaeological digs at these sites discovered European artifacts from the late 1580s or early 1590s, including pottery and metalwork that could have belonged to the lost colonists. Did some colonists travel 50 miles inland, establishing small settlements among Native Americans? The artifact suggested yes, but they didn't prove it. The items could have been trade goods, stolen materials, or belongings of different English explorers. The mystery remained unsolved. The most comprehensive archaeological survey came in 2020, when researchers conducted excavations at over a dozen sites across North Carolina. They found European artifacts at 7 locations, all dated to the period 1585 to 1595. The pattern suggested small groups of English colonists had scattered across a wide area, living in or near Native American villages. Some artifacts showed signs of adaptation, European tools modified for Native American purposes, English pottery decorated with Native American designs. The evidence pointed toward Theory 3. The colonists had left Roanoke voluntarily, split into multiple groups, and integrated with various Native American tribes. Some probably died from disease or hardship. Others likely survived and had children with Native Americans, their English identity gradually fading as they became part of their adopted communities. But even this theory couldn't be proven definitively. Without clear written records, without colonist remains identified through DNA, without incontrovertible physical evidence, the fate of the lost colony remained speculation. And so the mystery endured, not for lack of investigation, but because 400 years is simply too long. Time erases evidence. Forests reclaim settlements. Storms wash away traces. The lost colony had vanished not just in space, but in time, beyond the reach of archaeology, beyond the grasp of history, forever lost in the shadows between fact and legend. Who were the lost colonists? History remembers them as a group, 115 vanished people. But they were individuals with names, families, hopes, and fears. Understanding who they were helps us understand what might have happened to them. John White's colony was unlike the earlier military outposts at Roanoke. The 1587 expedition consisted of families recruited to establish a permanent English community. The passenger list included approximately 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children. Among them were craftsmen, farmers, a few gentlemen, a minister, and a physician. They were not soldiers seeking gold, but settlers seeking land and opportunity. The women were particularly important. In the brutal economics of colonial settlement, women's presence signaled serious intent. Men alone could be raiders or explorers. Men with wives and children were settlers committed to staying. The inclusion of pregnant women, Eleanor Dare and at least one other, demonstrated confidence that the colony would survive through winter and beyond. Eleanor Dare was approximately 25 years old, educated and literate like her father. Her husband, Ananias Dare, was a bricklayer and tiler from London, a skilled craftsman whose abilities would be valuable in constructing permanent buildings. Their daughter, Virginia Dare, born August 18, 1587, became the symbol of the colony, the first English child in the New World, representing a future that never came to be. Virginia's birth was celebrated by the colonists as a good omen. Within days, another colonist gave birth to a son. 2 healthy births suggested the new land was hospitable, that English families could thrive here. But infant mortality in the 16th century was staggering. Up to 30% of children died before age 5. Virginia and the unnamed boy faced long odds even without the extraordinary challenges ahead. Manteo was one of the most important people in the colony, though he was not English. He was CROATOAN, approximately 30 years old, who had traveled to England twice with English explorers. In London, he learned English, was baptized Christian, and developed genuine affection for English culture while maintaining his Native American identity. Upon returning to Roanoke in 1587, Manteo was knighted by Walter Raleigh, one of the first Native Americans to receive an English title. White appointed him as liaison between the colonists and local tribes, a role that should have been crucial for survival. Manteo's presence in the colony is one reason historians believe the colonists went to CROATOAN Island. Manteo was literally from there. His mother was a leader among the CROATOAN people. If the colonists needed refuge, Manteo could have advocated for them with his tribe. The word CROATOAN, carved at Roanoke, might have been Manteo's idea, a message telling anyone who came looking that the colonists had gone to his homeland. What happened to Manteo? He vanished along with everyone else. If he had died at Roanoke, surely the colonists would have mentioned it in messages left behind. If he went to CROATOAN, did he rejoin his people and watch the English colonists gradually die off or integrate? Or did he travel elsewhere with some colonists, ending his days in an unmarked grave in the Carolina wilderness? Among the men were a diverse group, whose skills tell us about White's planning. There was a minister, a physician, several farmers, a metal worker, carpenters, and laborers. Unlike Lane's gentleman soldiers who disdained physical work, these men were chosen because they could build houses, plant crops, fish, hunt, and perform the 100 essential tasks of colonial survival. White had learned from Lane's failure. Survival required practical men, not glory seekers. The colony's social structure was semi-democratic. White held the title of governor, but he was advised by 12 assistants who represented different families and interests. Decisions were made collectively, as evidenced by the group decision to send White back to England for supplies. This wasn't Lane's military dictatorship, but something closer to self-governance. England's first experiment with representative democracy in America. Among the assistants was Roger Pratt, about whom almost nothing is known, except that he signed documents as an assistant in July 1587, and presumably vanished with the others. There was Dionys Harvey, who brought his pregnant wife and children. There was Christopher Cooper, a skilled craftsman. There was John Sampson. What did these men think as John White sailed away? Did they feel abandoned, or did they trust he would return? Did they blame him when months became years? George Howe was one of the few colonists whose death is documented. Shortly after arriving at Roanoke in July 1587, Howe went crabbing alone in shallow water near the settlement. He was attacked and killed by Native Americans, likely CROATOAN warriors, who remembered Lane's violence and saw Howe as an easy target. Howe's death was a grim reminder that the colonists were not safe, that the indigenous people had long memories and legitimate grievances. It may have influenced the decision to relocate, either the whole colony to CROATOAN, or at least some families to safer locations. George Howe left behind a son, George Howe Jr., who was 12 years old. What happened to young George after his father's death? Did he go to CROATOAN with the others? Did he survive into adulthood? Was he absorbed into a Native American tribe, eventually forgetting his English origins? Or did he die young, another casualty of colonization's brutal arithmetic? The children are perhaps the most haunting presence in the lost colony story. Virginia Dare was the most famous, but there were at least 10 other children, some infants, some toddlers, some on the cusp of adolescence. In the 16th century, children were expected to work alongside adults from an early age. By age 7 or 8, they were hauling water, tending crops, helping with cooking and construction. The older children at Roanoke would have been contributors to the colony's survival, not burdens, but they were still children, vulnerable to disease, injury, and malnutrition. In Jamestown, children died at even higher rates than adults. The lost colony's children faced the same perils. If the colonists relocated to CROATOAN or traveled inland, the journey itself could have killed the weakest children. Even if they reached safety, disease or starvation might have taken them in the following months. Yet children are also adaptable. If the colonists integrated with Native American tribes, the children would have learned new languages, new customs, new ways of surviving. Within a generation, these children would have been indistinguishable from their adopted communities. Virginia Dare, if she survived to adulthood, might have married a Native American man, had children, and lived out her life as part of a tribe that remembered her origins. Only in legend. Local legend in North Carolina tells of a white doe that appeared in the forests near CROATOAN Island in the decades after the lost colony's disappearance. According to the story, the doe was the spirit of Virginia Dare, transformed by a Native American shaman. Hunters tried to kill the doe, but found she could not be harmed by ordinary arrows. Only a silver arrow could bring her down, and when she was finally killed, she transformed back into human form. A beautiful young woman with pale skin and light hair, who died gazing sadly toward the ocean where her grandfather's ships had once sailed. It's just a legend, of course, folklore created to explain the unexplainable, to give narrative shape to a mystery that resists resolution. But the legend endures because it offers an answer, even a tragic one. Virginia Dare didn't simply vanish. She lived. She was transformed. She became part of the land itself. The reality was probably less romantic. If Virginia survived infancy, she likely died young from disease, accident, or complications of childbirth, the common fates of women in that era. If she lived to adulthood, she probably married, had children, and died in her 30s or 40s, her English name forgotten, her origins a story her grandchildren didn't quite believe. The same would be true for all the colonists. Even if some survived and integrated with Native Americans, their English identity would fade within a generation or two. Their grandchildren would be Native American in every meaningful sense: language, culture, religion, worldview. The lost colony wouldn't just be lost in location, but lost in time, absorbed into indigenous societies that eventually faced their own destruction at the hands of later English colonization. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the lost colony. Even if some colonists survived, their fate was probably erasure. If they died at Roanoke, they died as English people. If they lived among Native Americans, they ceased being English within a generation. Either way, the people who left England in 1587 were gone. Their hopes, their dreams, their identities scattered like smoke. We know their names from the passenger list John White kept. We know some of their occupations, their relationships, their roles in the colony. But we don't know their thoughts, their fears, their final words. We don't know if they cursed John White for not returning, or if they understood that circumstances beyond his control had trapped him in England. We don't know if they died cursing their fate, or if they found peace in new lives among new people. The lost colony isn't just a historical mystery. It's 115 individual mysteries, 115 people who lived, hoped, struggled, and vanished. Some were probably buried in unmarked graves in the Carolina wilderness. Some might have grown old among the CROATOAN, their English words becoming legends told by their grandchildren. Some might have died violently, killed by disease or warfare. Some might have survived and prospered, their descendants walking among us today, unaware of their extraordinary heritage. We'll never know their individual fates, but we can honor their memory by remembering that they were people. Not just historical abstractions, not just names on a passenger list, but real human beings who crossed an ocean in pursuit of a dream that history forgot to record. The mystery of the lost colony refused to die. For more than 4 centuries, each generation has produced new investigators, new theories, and new searches for answers. The obsession with solving the mystery says as much about us as it does about the colonists. We cannot accept that some mysteries remain forever unsolved. In the 17th and 18th centuries, interest in the lost colony was limited mostly to historians and antiquarians, compiling the history of English colonization. The colonists were seen as unfortunate failures, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate preparation and poor planning. Jamestown's eventual success overshadowed Roanoke's failure. The lost colony became a footnote in the larger story of English America. But in the 19th century, American writers discovered the lost colony as a subject rich with narrative potential. The mystery appealed to the romantic sensibility, the tragic disappearance, the vulnerable women and children, the hostile wilderness, the unanswered questions. Poets wrote verses about Virginia Dare. Novelists invented elaborate scenarios explaining the colonists' fate. The lost colony entered American mythology, taking its place alongside other origin stories that blended history with legend. The most significant development came in 1888, when historians began seriously examining John White's original maps and journals, which had been preserved in the British Museum. These documents contained details that had been overlooked or forgotten. White's notes about geography, his observations about Native American tribes, his careful records of where the colonists had explored. Researchers realized that White had documented far more than just Roanoke Island. He had mapped regions 50 miles inland, identified Native American villages, and noted locations that seemed promising for future settlement. Could White's maps contain clues about where the colonists went? In 1890, researcher Talcott Williams proposed that the colonists had traveled northwest from Roanoke to the Chowan River area, where they established a settlement among the Chowanoke people. Williams based his theory on Native American testimonies collected at Jamestown, which mentioned English people living in that region in the early 1600s. But Williams couldn't prove his theory without physical evidence, and no archaeological work was done at the time to confirm it. In 1937, the first Dare stone was discovered near Edenton, North Carolina, a large stone with a message carved in Elizabethan English. The inscription was allegedly from Eleanor Dare, describing the colonists' journey inland from Roanoke, the deaths of many colonists from disease, and Eleanor's survival among Native Americans. The stone caused a sensation. If genuine, it would solve the mystery definitively. Within a year, more stones appeared, dozens of them, found across Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, each describing further adventures of Eleanor Dare and the surviving colonists. The stones told an epic story. The colonists had traveled hundreds of miles inland, fought battles with Native Americans, suffered from plague, gradually dwindled in numbers, until only Eleanor and a few others remained. The problem was obvious. The stones appeared too conveniently, always found by people who stood to profit from publicity. In 1940, A Saturday Evening Post investigation revealed that most of the stones were hoaxes created by a stonecutter who had been paid by individuals hoping to cash in on lost colony mania. The hoaxer confessed, and the Dare stones were discredited. But the first stone, the one found in 1937, was never definitively proven false. Some historians and geologists believe it might be genuine, though the confession of the stonecutter cast doubt on everything. The first Dare stone remains in a museum, labeled as possibly genuine, probably fake, a fitting summary of the entire lost colony mystery. Serious archaeological work began in the 1940s under the auspices of the National Park Service, which had jurisdiction over Fort Raleigh National Historic Site on Roanoke Island. Archaeologists excavated the fort location and found artifacts confirming English presence in the 1580s: pottery, nails, weaponry, copper items. But they found no evidence of what happened to the colonists. The settlement had been dismantled and abandoned, exactly as John White reported. In the 1980s, researchers began using new technologies to examine John White's maps more closely. In 1984, researchers at the British Museum discovered that one of White's maps had small patches glued over certain areas, as if White had made mistakes and covered them up. Using infrared imaging, they examined what was under the patches. They found symbols, small drawings indicating features White wanted to emphasize or hide. 2 patches, when removed, revealed symbols at inland locations away from Roanoke. One was at the confluence of the Roanoke and CROATOAN rivers. Another was near the Alligator River. What did these symbols mean? Some researchers theorized White had marked potential relocation sites for the colonists, places where they might go if Roanoke proved unsustainable. In 2002, archaeologists began excavating at the CROATOAN River site. They found European artifacts dating to the 1580s or 1590s, including pottery, metalwork, and a sword hilt. The items were consistent with English colonists from that period, but they didn't prove the lost colonists had been there. The artifacts could have belonged to traders, explorers, or other English visitors to the region. Additional excavations at the Alligator River site in 2010 uncovered similar artifacts: more pottery, tools, and fragments of European cloth. The pattern suggested English people had been living at multiple sites across eastern North Carolina in the late 16th century. If these were lost colonists, it supported the diaspora theory. The colonists had split into small groups and scattered across a wide territory. But proof was elusive. Without written records, without skeletons that could be DNA tested, without artifacts clearly labeled property of Eleanor Dare, archaeology could only suggest possibilities, not confirm facts. In 2020, a team from the CROATOAN Archaeological Society conducted the most comprehensive excavation yet of CROATOAN Island, now Hatteras Island. They excavated sites near where Manteo's village would have been located. The dig uncovered European artifacts mixed with Native American materials, pottery shards showing both English and CROATOAN styles, metal tools of English origin modified for indigenous uses, and most intriguingly, a signet ring of a type worn by English gentlemen in the 1580s. The ring bore a design that could have belonged to someone in the lost colony, though the design was too worn to identify conclusively. Nearby, they found the skeleton of a man buried in a style combining English and Native American traditions, laid out facing east, English Christian burial, but accompanied by shell beads and tobacco, Native American grave goods. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial in the late 16th or early 17th century. Was this a lost colonist who had integrated with the CROATOAN and been buried with honors from both cultures? It was possible, even probable. But the skeleton's DNA was too degraded for analysis. The researchers couldn't prove the man was English, only that he had been buried with European materials. The CROATOAN excavations provided the strongest archaeological evidence yet that some lost colonists went to that island and lived among the CROATOAN people. But some is not all. What happened to the others? Where did they go? In 2021, genetic researchers began analyzing DNA from the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, a Native American people who have long claimed descent from the lost colonists. The Lumbee have oral traditions about English ancestors who married into their tribe centuries ago. Some Lumbee people have surnames matching names on the lost colony passenger list: Dare, Cooper, Sampson, and others. DNA analysis found that many Lumbee people have small amounts of European ancestry, consistent with admixture occurring around the late 16th or early 17th century. The genetic signature matched England more closely than Spain or other European nations. It wasn't definitive proof. European genes could have entered the Lumbee population through other means, but it was consistent with the theory that some lost colonists survived and had children with Native Americans. The problem with all this evidence, archaeological, genetic, historical, is that it's circumstantial. Each piece could have an alternative explanation. European artifacts might have been trade goods. European DNA might come from later colonists. The lack of bodies at Roanoke might mean the colonists relocated, or it might simply mean their remains decomposed beyond recognition. To truly solve the mystery, researchers would need unambiguous evidence. A colonist's skeleton with dental work or bone structure clearly European, accompanied by artifacts bearing English names and dates. They would need documents written by the colonists themselves, explaining where they went and why. They would need living descendants who could be definitively traced back to specific lost colonists. None of these exist. After 430 years, such evidence has almost certainly disappeared. The lost colony will remain lost not because people stopped searching, but because time has erased the evidence we would need to solve the mystery conclusively. Yet the search continues. Every few years, a new archaeological project begins, a new theory emerges, a new book is published claiming to have solved the mystery. The lost colony has become an industry. There are museums, dramas, tourist attractions, scholarly conferences, and documentary films, all dedicated to the mystery. Some critics argued this attention is misplaced. Why obsess over 115 colonists from 1587 when millions of Native Americans died from disease and warfare in the centuries following European colonization? Why does the lost colony fascinate us when the genocide of indigenous peoples barely registers in popular consciousness? It's a fair criticism. The lost colony gets attention because the colonists were English-speaking, white, and European. Our ancestors, in other words, or at least the ancestors of the dominant American culture. Their disappearance feels tragic because we can imagine ourselves in their place. The deaths of indigenous people, by contrast, are treated as historical inevitability rather than tragedy. But perhaps the lost colony's enduring mystery serves a purpose beyond mere curiosity. It reminds us that colonization was not the glorious success story we sometimes imagine. The English colonists who crossed the Atlantic faced terrible odds. Most early colonies failed. Most colonists died. The survival of Jamestown and Plymouth was improbable luck, not inevitable destiny. The lost colony could have been any of the early colonies. Jamestown almost starved. Plymouth almost froze. Both survived by margins so narrow that a few different decisions could have doomed them. The lost colony is a reminder that history could have been different. If Roanoke had succeeded, North Carolina, not Virginia, might have been the birthplace of English America. If the colonists had survived, their descendants might be the dominant culture of the South. If John White had returned in 1588 instead of 1590, he might have found his family alive. History is contingent, not predetermined. The lost colony embodies that contingency, the fragile thread separating success from failure, survival from death, history from oblivion. The word CROATOAN haunts American history. 500 letters carved into wood by desperate hands. A message meant to be read by John White, read instead by centuries of historians, archaeologists, and mystery enthusiasts. A word that has generated thousands of books, articles, theories, and debates. A word that remains fundamentally unexplained. What did the colonists mean when they carved CROATOAN? The simplest interpretation is that they were telling White where they had gone. To CROATOAN Island, 50 miles south, where Manteo's people lived. This interpretation assumes the colonists planned carefully, left a clear message, and successfully relocated to a place where they believed they could survive until relief came. But another interpretation is darker. The colonists carved CROATOAN as a desperate plea, indicating where they hoped to go, not where they successfully arrived. Perhaps storms prevented the journey. Perhaps hostile tribes blocked the route. Perhaps the colonists died trying to reach safety, leaving only the intended destination carved in wood. Or perhaps the message wasn't written by the colonists at all. Some historians have suggested that Native Americans, either CROATOAN people or others, carved the word as a misdirection, either to protect the colonists' actual location or to confuse English searchers. Manteo, if he was still alive and wanted to protect his people from further English intrusion, might have carved a false message to send searchers in the wrong direction. We'll never know. The word CROATOAN is like a text message sent across 4 centuries, corrupted by time, stripped of context, open to infinite interpretation. John White died believing the colonists had gone to CROATOAN and survived there. His final writings expressed hope that they were alive, integrated with Manteo's people, waiting for rescue that never came. It's a kinder interpretation than most. White preferred to believe his daughter and granddaughter lived, even if he never saw them again. But White was also a realist. He knew the odds. In his final published account of the lost colony, written in 1593, he acknowledged that the weather was so foul, the winds so strong, and the seas so rough that reaching CROATOAN had been impossible. He admitted that he greatly feared for the colonists' safety. He knew that years of isolation, with no supplies and no support, would have taken a terrible toll. White's final written words about the lost colony are heartbreaking in their restraint. Thus committing the relief of my discomfortable company, the planters in Virginia, to the merciful help of the Almighty, whom I most humbly beseech to help and comfort them. He prayed. It was all he could do. The mystery of the lost colony has become a permanent feature of American culture. Every generation rediscovers it, reinterprets it, reimagines it. In the 1930s, playwright Paul Green wrote The Lost Colony, an outdoor drama that has been performed every summer since 1937 on Roanoke Island, making it the longest-running outdoor theater production in American history. The play blends historical facts with invented dialogue and scenes, creating a narrative that's part history, part myth. Thousands of people attend the Lost Colony performances each year. They sit under the stars and watch actors portray John White, Virginia Dare, Manteo, and the other colonists. They hear the story of hope, survival, and disappearance. They feel the emotional weight of a people who crossed an ocean seeking new lives and vanished without explanation. The play ends ambiguously. The colonists depart Roanoke, singing hopeful songs about their journey to CROATOAN. John White returns to find them gone. The audience is left wondering, as White wondered, as historians wonder. What happened next? In 2015, the television show American Horror Story featured a season set in Roanoke, using the lost colony as the basis for a horror narrative involving ghosts, curses, and supernatural forces. The show took extreme creative liberties, inventing a backstory where the colonists made deals with dark spirits and became something inhuman. It was entertainment, not history, but it demonstrated how the lost colony continues to fire the imagination 4 centuries later. The lost colony appears in novels, video games, comic books, and podcasts. Some treatments are respectful of historical evidence. Others use the mystery as a blank canvas for imagination. But all share a common impulse: the need to give the lost colony a narrative resolution, even if it's fictional. Why does the lost colony fascinate us more than other historical mysteries? America has many unexplained disappearances, unsolved crimes, and mysterious events. But the lost colony holds unique cultural power. Perhaps it's because the colonists represent America's origin story, the first English families attempting to build a new world in a strange land. Their failure is our fear. What if the American experiment had failed from the beginning? What if colonization was impossible and the colonists simply died or disappeared? Or perhaps the fascination comes from the specificity of the mystery. We know exactly who the colonists were when they disappeared, and the circumstances surrounding their vanishing. We have John White's maps, journals, and desperate searches. We have the word CROATOAN. We have enough information to feel tantalizingly close to an answer, yet the answer remains out of reach. The lost colony is a puzzle with most pieces present, but the crucial pieces missing. We can see the outline of what happened, but the center remains blank. That incompleteness is maddening and magnetic in equal measure. In recent years, climate science has added a new dimension to the lost colony mystery. Tree ring data shows that the period from 1510 to 1589 was the driest 3-year stretch in North Carolina in the past 800 years. The colonists arrived during the worst drought in recorded regional history. Crops would have failed. Water sources would have dried up. Game animals would have migrated away. The colonists were fighting not just human adversaries, but nature itself. This drought might explain why the colonists left Roanoke. The island's limited freshwater sources couldn't support 115 people during a severe drought. The colonists would have needed to relocate somewhere with reliable water, either CROATOAN Island, which had freshwater wells, or inland to rivers that still flowed even during drought. The drought also might explain why no significant Native American villages existed near Roanoke in 1587. Indigenous people would have abandoned the area during the drought, moving to more sustainable locations. The colonists arrived in a temporarily uninhabitable region, built a settlement that couldn't be sustained, and eventually had to follow the indigenous people's example by relocating. Climate data doesn't solve the mystery, but it provides context. The lost colony didn't disappear because of poor planning alone. They faced environmental conditions that would have challenged even well-prepared settlers. In a sense, the drought was the invisible antagonist of the story, a force the colonists couldn't see coming and couldn't overcome. What would it mean if the lost colony mystery were solved tomorrow? If archaeologists found definitive proof that the colonists relocated to CROATOAN, integrated with the tribe, and lived out their lives peacefully? Or if they found mass graves proving all the colonists died in a plague winter shortly after White left? Some argue that solving the mystery would diminish it. The lost colony's power comes from its ambiguity, the space for imagination, speculation, and personal interpretation. Knowing the answer might make the story less interesting, reducing it from mystery to mere history. Others counter that solving the mystery would be profoundly meaningful. The colonists deserve to be remembered accurately, not imagined. Their descendants, if any exist, deserve to know their heritage. And from a historical perspective, understanding what happened would illuminate the early days of English colonization, helping us understand how and why later colonies succeeded where Roanoke failed. The truth is that both outcomes would be important, but neither would satisfy our deeper need, the need to know not just what happened, but why it matters. The lost colony has become more than a historical puzzle. It's a meditation on disappearance itself, on the fragility of memory, on the thin line between recorded history and forgotten oblivion. In 2025, archaeological teams working on Hatteras Island made their most significant discovery yet. Excavating near the site where Manteo's CROATOAN village once stood, researchers found extensive evidence of metalworking, buckets of hammer scale, the telltale residue left by blacksmithing. Native Americans in the 16th century didn't work metal. This was evidence of English colonists living and working alongside the CROATOAN people for years, possibly decades. The findings supported what Scott Dawson and the CROATOAN Archaeological Society had argued for years. The lost colony was never lost. They went to CROATOAN Island, exactly as the carved message indicated. They integrated with Manteo's people. They survived, not as a separate English colony, but as part of a Native American community. The 2025 discoveries included English pottery fragments mixed with CROATOAN cooking vessels, suggesting shared meals and shared lives. They found copper trade goods that had been reworked using Native American techniques. They found evidence of English construction methods adapted to use local materials. The archaeological record painted a picture of cultural blending. English colonists learning to live as the CROATOAN lived, gradually adopting indigenous ways while contributing their own skills. But this discovery, as significant as it was, still didn't solve the complete mystery. It suggested that some colonists went to CROATOAN and survived there. But what about the others? Did all 115 colonists go to CROATOAN, or did some split off to other locations? The archaeological evidence at inland sites, the locations marked on John White's hidden map, suggested multiple relocation sites. Perhaps the colony didn't stay together, but fragmented into smaller groups, each seeking survival in different ways. This fragmentation would explain why no single site contains evidence of all the colonists. It would explain the scattered reports of European-looking people among various Native American tribes. It would explain why solving the mystery requires piecing together evidence from dozens of locations across eastern North Carolina. The Lumbee tribe's genetic evidence supports this theory. DNA analysis shows European ancestry entering the Lumbee population around the late 16th century, consistent with lost colonists marrying into the tribe. But the European genetic signature is diffuse, spread across many family lines rather than concentrated in a few. This suggests multiple English colonists integrated with the tribe over time, not as a single mass migration, but as individuals, and small families joining the community gradually. If this interpretation is correct, then the lost colony's fate was neither dramatic massacre nor mysterious disappearance. It was something more mundane, but also more profound: assimilation. The colonists, faced with impossible odds, chose survival over English identity. They joined Native American communities, adopted indigenous ways, and within a generation or two, their descendants were Native American in every meaningful sense. This outcome challenges the traditional narrative of English colonization. We're taught that English settlers maintained their identity, built separate communities, and eventually dominated the continent. The lost colony reminds us that colonization could have gone differently. If circumstances had been slightly altered, English colonists might have been absorbed into Native American societies rather than displacing them. In an alternate history, Virginia Dare might have grown up as a CROATOAN woman, speaking Algonquian, wearing deerskin, married to a Native American man, raising children who never knew they had English ancestry. In this version of history, the lost colony isn't lost at all. It's transformed, integrated, woven into the fabric of indigenous life. But this hopeful interpretation faces a grim reality. If the lost colonists did integrate with Native American tribes, their descendants faced the same genocidal violence that European colonization inflicted on all indigenous peoples. The CROATOAN, the Lumbee, the CROATOAN, and other tribes of coastal North Carolina were decimated by disease, warfare, and forced removal over the following centuries. If Virginia Dare's descendants survived, they endured centuries of oppression, displacement, and cultural destruction. The irony is bitter. The colonists who failed to establish an English settlement may have survived by joining Native American communities, only for their descendants to be destroyed by later English colonization. The lost colony escaped one fate only to meet another. This is why the mystery of the lost colony carries such weight. It's not just about 115 missing people. It's about the collision of worlds, the violence of colonization, the fragility of identity, and the erasure of history. The lost colony represents everyone who was lost in the brutal centuries following European arrival in America. Not just English colonists, but the indigenous peoples whose civilizations were destroyed, whose languages were forgotten, whose histories were erased. When we search for the lost colony, we're searching for something larger than a historical fact. We're searching for connection across time, for proof that the past mattered, for evidence that lives lived centuries ago left traces we can still find and honor. We want to believe that disappearance isn't final, that mysteries can be solved, that the lost can be found. But some losses are permanent. Some disappearances are absolute. Some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to remind us of what we can never recover. John White carved his own legacy by failing to return in time. His daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia, and 112 other colonists vanished because White was delayed by storms, wars, and circumstances beyond his control. He spent his final years consumed by guilt and grief, wondering what would have happened if he'd returned sooner, if he'd been more insistent, if he'd found a way. History doesn't offer White redemption. The colonists remained lost. His family remained gone. But White's careful documentation, his maps, his drawings, his written accounts, preserved the memory of people who might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. Because of White, we know their names. Because of White, we know they existed. They hoped, they tried to build something new in a dangerous world. That preservation of memory might be the only resolution the lost colony mystery offers. We may never know exactly where the colonists went, or how they died, or who their descendants are. But we know they lived. We know they mattered. We know their story, incomplete as it is, tells us something important about courage, tragedy, and the costs of colonization. The word CROATOAN, carved into wood 435 years ago, has survived when the people who carved it have not. The message outlasted the messengers. The mystery outlived its subjects. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the lost colony's greatest legacy isn't where they went or how they survived, but that they're still remembered, still discussed, still debauched for, centuries after they vanished. Every generation rediscovers the lost colony and makes it meaningful in new ways. In the 19th century, they were tragic victims of savage wilderness. In the 20th century, they became symbols of American frontier courage. In the 21st century, they're evidence of cultural complexity, of the possibilities of integration and cooperation between English and Native American peoples. What will future generations make of the lost colony? In 50 years, in 100 years, will anyone still care about 115 colonists who disappeared in 1587? Or will the mystery finally fade, the last scholars lose interest, the archaeological sites be destroyed by development and climate change, and the lost colony fade into complete oblivion, lost not just physically, but from memory itself? It's possible. Most historical events are forgotten. Most people who have ever lived are lost to history, their names unrecorded, their stories indled. The lost colonists are remembered only because their disappearance was documented, because they were part of the English colonization project that eventually succeeded in creating the United States. If the colonists had been indigenous people instead of English settlers, would anyone remember them? Would anyone search for them? Would anyone care? Probably not. And that reality casts a shadow over the entire lost colony fascination. We care about these missing people because they were our cultural ancestors. We don't care nearly as much about the thousands of Native Americans who died or were displaced to make room for English colonies. The asymmetry is striking and uncomfortable, but perhaps the lost colony can teach us something about this asymmetry by showing us that English colonists could disappear, could be vulnerable, could fail catastrophically. The lost colony reminds us that colonization was not inevitable destiny, but a series of contingent events that could have gone differently. The victims weren't just Native Americans, but also the colonists themselves, pawns in imperial schemes that cared little for individual lives. The mystery endures because it refuses easy answers. It sits at the intersection of history and myth, fact and speculation, hope and tragedy. It's a story with no ending, a puzzle with missing pieces, a question that generates only more questions. Perhaps that's what makes the lost colony matter. In a world that demands certainty, that insists on answers, that treats every mystery as a problem to be solved, the lost colony resists. It remains unknowable. It exists in the space between what we can prove and what we can imagine. It reminds us that history is not a collection of facts, but a web of stories, some complete, some fragmentary, some lost entirely. The colonists of Roanoke crossed an ocean seeking new lives. They found hardship, danger, and ultimately, disappearance. But they also found something unexpected, immortality through mystery. They became legends precisely because they vanished. Had they survived and prospered, they would be forgotten footnotes in history books. Because they disappeared, they live forever in speculation and story. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, existed for perhaps 3 years, perhaps 3 decades. We don't know. But 4 centuries later, people still speak her name, still wonder about her fate, still imagine her life. That's a kind of immortality, even if it's not the kind anyone would choose. The lost colony remains lost. Not because we haven't searched hard enough, not because the evidence is impossible to find, but because 435 years is simply too long. The forest has reclaimed their houses. The ocean has swallowed their settlements. The earth has consumed their bones. Time itself has erased them. What remains is the word CROATOAN, carved in desperation, or hope, or both, a message across centuries that we still struggle to understand. What remains are artifacts in museums, pottery shards, and metal fragments that hint at lives lived and lost. What remains are oral traditions among Native American peoples, stories of white strangers who came and stayed and became part of the community. What remains is the mystery itself, the unanswered question that connects us to people 4 centuries dead, the puzzle that refuses to be solved, the story that has no ending. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the lost colony's purpose isn't to be found, but to be remembered. To remind us that history is full of disappearances, full of forgotten people, full of stories that will never be recovered. The lost colony stands for all the lost, the unnamed, the unremembered, the vanished without trace. John White's final act was to commit the colonists to the merciful help of God. More than 4 centuries later, we continue that act, preserving their memory even as their fate remains unknown. We honor them not by solving their mystery, but by refusing to forget them. We keep them alive through our curiosity, our research, our endless fascination with their disappearance. The lost colony of Roanoke is more than history. It's a reminder that some losses can never be recovered, some mysteries can never be solved, and some people can never truly come home. But as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their story, as long as we wonder what happened to those 115 souls who carved CROATOAN into wood and walked into history, they are not entirely lost. They live in the questions we ask. They exist in the archaeology we uncover. They survive in the stories we tell. And in that survival, fragile, incomplete, uncertain, they achieve what every colonist dreams of. They endure. The mystery of the lost colony will probably never be solved. But the legacy of the lost colony is already clear. They remind us that in history, as in life, some disappearances are final. Some questions have no answers, and some people are remembered precisely because they cannot be found. CROATOAN. The word echoes across centuries, a message we still struggle to read, a mystery that refuses to die. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished. Some mysteries are meant to endure. Some losses are meant to be permanent reminders of everything we can never recover, never understand, never find. The lost colony remains lost. And in that loss, they found something unexpected, a permanent place in history, a mystery that will outlive us all, a story that refuses to end. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. And in the end, perhaps that's the only immortality any of us can hope for.